Okay. Nā mau haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa, kei te mihi aho, kei te maru o Papahu. Ko tāra tāko ingoa. Nō rewa, tēnā koutou katoa, e na mana, e na reo, e na karangatanga maha. Tēnā koutou katoa. Talofa lava, ola vanika, kia orana, malo o lele, and warm Pacific greetings. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion based on the 2023 draft advice to inform the strategic direction of the government's second emissions reduction plan. I had to write that down so that I got that right. Yeah. This draft advice has been prepared by Gehricke Orangi Climate Change Commission, and they are here today as part of their initial consultation on this document, which they aim to have finalised by the end of the year, and they'll talk you through that process as well. Barry Anderson, who's General Manager of Sector Analysis, and Grant Blackwell, Chief Scientist, will address the topic of how pricing and complementary policies could help us meet our climate objectives. Along with our two panel members from Otago, Professor Anne-Marie Jackson is one of the leaders of the core Coastal People Southern Skies here in Otago, and well known for her research aiming to indigenise science. And as Dr. Sebastian Gehricke, sorry, made a mess of that one. My German's not too good today, is the co-leader of the Centre for Climate Energy Finance and has recently completed projects on abatement and offsetting and is an expert in carbon markets and finance and sustainable investing. Each panellist will give a short statement, and if I say go too long, then they'll hear me cough. and then we'll move into audience Q&A after that. So we're hoping this is a lively session with lots of questions, which we're here to address. Awesome. I'll pass it over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zara, and kia ora koutou. Thank you for the opportunity to come down here. It's a few familiar faces I see, and I see a few years ago just crossed the road in zoology, so it's nice to come back down here. Barry and I are going to sort of tag team, start fairly broad, and then get closer and closer to the advice. And by the time we get to Anne-Marie and see information, we're talking about the specific advice, and then happy to take questions and discussion. So I just wanted to start with a few, just sort of three quick points around our role and our approach to our work, just for the framing around us. You've obviously heard of us enough to be here today, so I'm aware of the Commission. But I guess three things I wanted to touch on. The first is our role, so it's set out in the Climate Change Response Act. And in a nutshell, our job is to give independent advice to the government of the day to help us meet our climate goals. That's around emissions reduction and adaptation. And we have a role around monitoring progress, government progress around their plans and policies. So in terms of emissions reduction, that means we give advice on emissions budgets and give advice on the direction of policy for the government's emission reduction plans, which is what we're going to talk about today. And Gary will give a little bit more detail around that. And so that's a task we do every 5 years. Our first advice was in 2021. On July 29 was the first advice we gave, and this is advice on the second budget. So we'll be coming back every 5 years and doing the same sort of process. In terms of our approach, the way we do our work, there are really sort of three key things that we keep in mind. So the first is our independence. We're an independent Crown entity with our functions set out in the Climate Change Response Act. So we don't have a minister telling us what to do. We don't have a ministry telling us what to do. They can't tell us how to do our work or how to change our conclusions. And the flip side is they don't actually have to take our advice, but we can give that advice without fear or favour based on our tasks that are set out in the Act. The second pillar really is around engagement. So we can give all the best advice in the world, but it's individuals, it's communities, it's businesses, it's whānau that actually make the decisions that make emissions go up or go down and affect how we adapt. So it's critical for us as we're doing our work that we're out actually engaging, talking with people, listening to people, understanding what those opportunities are, what those challenges are, what those barriers are. So when we give our advice, it's practical, it's achievable, and it actually helps us transition to that low emissions future that we're heading towards, or hopefully heading towards. And the third is that we're evidence-based. So once critical, we understand the context and we hear those viewpoints. The job we do is built on that evidence base of what's achievable, what the risks and opportunities are, what the costs are, and build that up. So independent evidence-based advice is critical. And then the final point I just wanted to make is that the Act sets out a whole bunch of criteria that we have to consider in all the advice that we give. So Section 5M of the Climate Change Response Act, if you're not familiar with it, it's a fascinating read, but it sets out a half dozen odd or so considerations that we need to take into account. So that's current scientific understanding of climate change. It's the actions of other nations to act on climate change. It's social, cultural, environmental, and economic impacts and consequences of our advice, how our advice might affect regions and generations, the Crown Māori relationship. There's a whole range of things we have to consider with the intention that our advice then is well-rounded and it takes society on that journey. So if you're looking and thinking, well, why have they said that, or why have they got that in there, or why have they gone too far, not far enough, 5M is your friend to get an understanding of that broad range of things we have to consider. It's probably enough from me. Hopefully, Barry, that sets you up to.
Sure. Kia ora, everyone. Thanks for having us, and thanks for coming out and having a chat. To kind of zoom in a little bit more from the 30,000-foot view that Grant provided, when the Commission provided its, inaugural, mega deliverable in 2021, at that point, there was almost no architecture in place. The result of that was that the government accepted advice and notified on emissions budgets 1, 2, and 3, and emissions reduction plan 1 is in place for the period of 2022 to 2025. This document that we have out for consultation right now is kind of the next iteration on the 5-year treadmill that we're on. Every 5 years, we have to give the government advice for an emissions reduction plan that's coming up for the next budget period. So this one is for the 2026-2030 period, and we have to hand this advice over to government by the end of this calendar year so they can do their stuff and have a plan in place for when the budget period starts. As Grant said, the Act, we're not unconstrained in the work that we do or how we do it. Thoughtful politicians at the time when the Act was updated said, you can't give us advice unless it looks like this, unless you've been thoughtful and well-rounded in your work. It has to take into account all these things. We can't just have single focus, kind of unilateral advice. So that gives us taking all that into account, how do we do this work to figure out what's important for the actions that the government considers for the end of this decade? There's about 1 million things going on out there in business, society, and all this stuff that's either going to help, hurt, adapt, create resiliency or not with climate change. We need to figure out a way to get from, the wide part of the funnel down to, what are the big rocks here? And so our staff was really insightful in putting together a pretty simple way to do it. We, through a sheer stroke of marketing genius, we called it our prioritization framework. And it is simply a rough rubric of all the things that are out there that are important. What does the government really need to know? What really matters? The other aspect of that is that emissions reduction plan 1 that the government published resulted in roughly 400 actions underway. So there's already, the flywheel of momentum started with public policy action. Is it good enough? Is it going to help us get where we need to get? TBD. But there's stuff going on. So our task with this emissions reduction plan advice is to try to figure out where are the gaps, where's the risks to non-achievement, what trajectory are we on, and where do we need to put a little more juice into it. That's the high level stuff. So yeah, I'm just, I think since I was set up to speak mostly about emissions pricing, I'll speak to, for folks taking notes in the room, chapter 3 and chapter 4 is where our board decided they really wanted to put the foot in the ground and say, the path to net zero matters. What does that mean? It means that what is the plan for the contributions of sequestration and the net side of the ledger versus emissions to air, and what kind of gross trajectory should we be on? Unless we do something on purpose and set our policy designs and objectives and systems to achieve those results, we're kind of just going to get what we get. And it may or may not be good, depending on how you think about good. So in chapter 3, we make the point that government should signal a gross emissions trajectory that it wants to try to design policy for. And in chapter 4, we say, if you take that advice and you step into the next realm, then you need to take a hard look at how the emissions trading scheme is operated right now and its settings, because there's a high risk that it's not fit for purpose for delivering the long-term outcomes that it's intended to. I'll stop there. I didn't hear a cough, but I feel like we should.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Martin. So I think something I want to mention is that I think the people, that being consumers or general public or retail investors themselves in financial institutions, business leaders, and also the iwi leaders that I've talked to all want to transition, right? We all want to do these things, but they require hard choices. And as we all know, hard choices need to be incentivized, right? So what we need is the right rules to set the playing field and incentives to push people in the right direction, and some support for those that are damaged by this pathway to keep going. So I think around the ETS, the whole idea is to provide incentives to reduce emissions, currently net emissions, right? And I think currently, from some work we've done that I can't mention too much yet, a lot of leaders are already focusing on abatement, right? They want to reduce emissions, business leaders. But they are also expecting the emissions price to increase in the future. Just like the government has said that its emission reduction plan relies on an increasing carbon price. Yet what we've seen in the last year is a range of policies which have decreased the carbon price, in my opinion. So we saw that the Climate Change Commission gave advice around the cost containment reserve to be lifted and the volume of that to be increased. The government took half that advice and just increased the volume and kept the price ceiling low. So prices cannot increase. Subsequently, the market price dropped. The government last year proposed a ban on exotic permanent forests and has since put that on hold. When that ban was proposed, we saw the largest increase in ETS registration we've ever seen. There was 140,000 hectares of new forests registered into the ETS from January 22 to 23, which is almost double that over the last 5 years, or almost a third of what we had prior to 2022. So that I believe that sort of scare of a possible ban on exotics pushed everyone to get their forests planted and registered. We also have industrial allocation, which is massively over allocated, right? They were actually subsidizing polluters. So some of the arguments that I heard around why these policies were enacted is because the government was worried about the carbon price inflating prices in the economy. Yet the whole point of the carbon price is to inflate the costs of polluting activity. So what are we trying to do, right? So I guess overall, I hope the government can listen to its advice commission a little bit more. Another sort of issue we have around all this is the ag pricing scheme, right? It's about half our global warming potential emissions come out of our agricultural sector. And so we have this proposed pricing scheme at 11 cents per kg of methane, which is equivalent to between $2.75 or $4.40 per CO2 tonne. The ETS price is currently on 50 something and has been as high as 90. In the EU, it's over 100 euros. So that's a very cheap price for emissions. And, there was advice in the draft advice around broadening the payments back to farmers for incentivizing them to do good activities. And currently that proposed scheme only looked at unproven technologies or technologies that aren't yet commercially viable. I suggest we also include farm management practice, and I think the advice talks to that as well, particularly things like regenerative agriculture, maybe even permaculture if you want to go that far. So overall, I guess I propose we get rid of exotics in the ETS, and then we don't need to worry about the negative side effects of having, all this Pinus radiata everywhere. I suggest we decrease or have no industrial allocation, because why should those companies that have polluted the most now pay less? They should just pay for their emissions. We do not hold the price within a floor and a ceiling. We let the price be determined by supply and demand and manage what kind of supply we're okay with. And we have penalties for those foresters that, for example, propose they have a transition forest that never then transitions. Maybe they should pay back those credits. Maybe they should be held in escrow, etc. So anyway, I'll stop talking there. I have lots of ideas and lots of problems, but I hope that gives you some questions to work from.
Tēnā koutou, ko whakarau I nei raro I tēnei karanga kaupapa o te wā. Ko poko ko te tariwha, ko rangiriri te rākau whakangautai, ko poiro te ngaru mahuhu tuaka, rongo mai ka ariki ko Ngāti Whātua te iwi, me te ia tu hononga ki te taitukerau, ko ngā pui nui tonu, ko Ngāti Wai, Ngāti Kahu o Whangaroa anō hoki. Tēnā koe I tōku tuahine, ko hara mai ki te moana nui a kia, tēnā koe Brittany, me tōku tuakana kei ko Mirata tēnā koe. Atui tira tēnā koe Sarah, koutou katoa, ko karanga mai kia, ki hara mai tēnei tēpu me ki. Good morning everybody, my name is Anne-Marie Jackson and I'm here in two roles. One is as one of the co-directors of the National Centre of Research Excellence Coastal People, Southern Skies, and our focus is on our vision is Māori order or flourishing wellness of coastal peoples. And secondly, as a Professor of Indigenous Wellbeing within the newly established Centre of Indigenous Science here at the University of Otago from our Research Excellence, Indigenous Research Excellence Group, Koronga. My comments really are in relation to Chapter 5, Whai Ngā Tapu Wai, Advancing Iwi Māori Climate Change Leadership, and then Chapter 6, Maintaining and Enhancing Wellbeing through the Transition. And some of the comments that I would make is primarily around language. So one, there's quite a lot of blurring in the current advice that's been given to government in relation to Te Tiriti and the treaty. Te Tiriti, our founding constitutional document, sets a pathway for what Crown Māori relationships look like, and also as a platform for the place that we are for all New Zealanders, whether we are born here or we arrive here or we've occupied this place since the dawn of time. And within that landscape are the three articles. Number one, kāwanatanga, or this idea of, from a Ngāpuhi perspective, certainly, so that is the kāwanatanga or the role that government has in shaping the understandings for the non-Indigenous world that we live in. Secondly is tēnō rangatiratanga or Article 2, and so that's about setting out the priorities that is by Māori for Māori, and in Article 3, which is equity. So the Commission has made a jump already through to equity, transitioning through to Article 3. And so in order to reach Article 3, we must power up, or as the colloquial language that I like to use, power up Article 2, and which you'll see in the documentation, that is around increasing resource and increasing leadership for Māori. Now, it's important that those things that are for Māori by Māori also include the ensuring the health and wellbeing for all New Zealanders, so that the lens through which it's done is through a Māori lens as Indigenous peoples of this place. In Article 1, what is the role of government in powering up? Article 2, these notions of Māori self-determination. In the documents that are here that's out for advice at the moment, there's a lot of slippage in language between the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a different document to Te Tiriti. Neither are a direct translation of the other two. And so in legal jurisprudence, always that treaty that is written in the Indigenous language has the precedence over that which is not written in the Indigenous language. So the Treaty of Waitangi is a watered down version of Te Tiriti, and you'll see some of the slippage in the language where we move into partnership, roughly aligned to Article 1. Partnership is not the same thing as sovereignty. Number 2, where you will see the notions of protection. Protection is not the same as ultimate power and authority, which is in Te Tiriti, and then Article 3, which is participation. So the right for Māori and non-Māori to walk in both worlds. So participation is not the same as equity. And so those are the things that I think there needs to be more thinking, more explicit description and definition in relation to the language that is being used. I also think that it needs to be Chapter 5, too far down the pecking order. 2, so it needs to be elevated so that it can be clear what is it that the Commission's wanting to advise government on in that Crown Māori relationship. And we all know we can get the relationship side of things right. No matter whether it's between Māori and the Crown, the time for consultation is critical. and reading through the documents again, also understanding some of the things that are going on. The consultation process is very short too. And so as we know, those things create increased frustration within a process that often the people who are, according to this, the ones that are needing to be the most engaged, therefore become frustrated and annoyed and then further excluded from a process that isn't wanting to do that. And then my second point is in relation to wellbeing. At the moment, I still think that there's scope. And I mean this, if I bring our National Centre of Research Excellence, we're about to shift from 2025 to 2028 to have a whole national centre that is focused on wellbeing, the impact of climate change on wellbeing in relation to coastal people in the marine environment. So I think there's still opportunity to really further define what is meant by wellbeing. Some of the language, again, is in relation to aspects that are coming from Treasury, and some of the advice in relation to the papers that will create out of way order. For example, a wonderful model that people can download to have a look at. It has come out of tax and also out of Treasury. So is that what we're thinking that wellbeing is? That the Climate Change Commission should be taking the advice from that? And if it is, that's great. Probably just having some of the people side more explicitly built within it in the descriptions of what wellbeing are. If those are two of the principal drivers around the advice that is being promoted through to government from the Commission. And my last point is in relation to the marine environment. And so still there isn't, I believe, and certainly from our perspective of our core, our Centre of Research Excellence, is where is the specific advice and direction in relation to the marine and to the marine environment, particularly given the importance of the marine environment to Aotearoa, our exclusive economic zone, for example, and also the opportunities for carbon sinks, etc. Mentions, but I think that certainly those things could be further described even more. Kia ora.
Okay, now mihi, to our panelists. Now, do we have some questions? Open up now for Q&A, and as you said, this is now opportunity for there to be robust discussion, I would imagine. Thank you.
I'll start I am wondering more and more when somebody is going to put up their hand and say we need to tell the truth about this. The truth is that no dollar is underwritten without energy being expended, us doing work, producing something. We are playing games, trying to do money number juggling to try and prove that we can stuff a spud up the exhaust pipe of what we're doing. It's the wrong end. All you have to do is stop buying the petrol at the pump, right? But we're playing these games as a whole society. You are part of it, all of you, right? With one possible exception. You are part of pretending and playing and extending this game. Why don't you put your hands up and say, we can't do this. We can't do it economically. We can't sink the carbon that was in the ground, that we are digging up and throwing into the atmosphere that we've been evolving in with it all under there. There is no sink capacity. There is no offset. We can't do it economically. That's nonsense. Those are just tokens. Why don't you just put your hands up and say that? This is a university. You guys are paid public servants. Why don't we hear that?
Well, the unsatisfactory answer is that we're not, I think that you would get a different answer if the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment was sitting on the stage and you asked him that question. Because, for example, that publicly funded function has a wide remit and he can do whatever he wants and can say whatever he wants and he can determine his own business plan. We're not like that, operating in a Crown entity under a very prescriptive section of the Climate Change Response Act. So personal feelings aside, our work plan and how we go about our work has been very well decreed by the politicians that voted to update the CCRA. And the reality is that if society doesn't think that's a good set of rules for us to do our job, then the electoral process is the way for that to happen. As people who work in the commission, as staff, or even as board members of the commission, they can't advise the government to change the act. It's not in scope for us. So that's a very unsatisfactory answer to the question that you've asked.
It is, but it raises
the
a
reality.
question that you and the university need to think about, which is siloing, hiding behind the silo walls. Because ultimately, this is a whole society that's walking into this mess.
Yeah, I think
It's
that's
everybody.
a really valid point. And so I think it's thoughtful to think about, you know, what is the Climate Change Commission for? We're super deep and super across issues related to climate change, but you know, we're meant to consider co-benefits and those kinds of things and other ecological impacts, but we give our advice over to a centralized decision maker that takes integrated decisions. That is Parliament and Cabinet. Sorry, that is Cabinet. So from that point of view, us not being an integrated all things environment function is kind of on purpose.
The point then perhaps flows that advice cannot be taken, as was your point earlier, right? And so let's say maybe this point then, or is this good gentleman's point, is included as the single bullet point of advice that ought to be then taken to government, to cabinet. That can then be ignored wholly. Is how do we make this work then? Because it sounds to me that transition is not going to be just. Transition is not going to be comfortable for most. That's advice then on the basis of discomfort, injustice, it's easily going to be ignored at a point when it comes to legislation, when it comes to enforcement, when it comes to creating workable solutions here to get to this dream goal. Even if it were included in the advice, how do we make that happen? How do again, to the point of the silos, how do we expand outside of those silos? How do we get something that where the good advice that's already hard to come by then is actually heard and acted upon?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess one way that I guess within our remit, which again is I feel like a bit of a cop out, but we can help with that. So we also have our monitoring function. So we have to look at what does the site say, what's the feasibility, what are the costs, how good, bad, or ugly might the cost be, and give advice in that space and say we need to be, there is risk people left behind if we have a solely focus on, you know, the ETS is just allowing afforestation, there's impacts on communities, we don't decarbonise, what those impacts we see might be, and then we come back and we monitor adequacy and effectiveness of government's plans, and if they're choosing to ignore, for our ETS advice where we said you need to have prices driving change, and they took their units and didn't take the the price advice, we basically just doubled down this year and said, if you want to do this job to help send a signal and polluters to make decisions, you need to be taking this whole package of advice and you need these prices to be doing their job. So we didn't say, oh, well, okay, you know, it's a bit hard because it might raise the cost of living on some people. We said, if you want to get economy shifting and making decisions to try and make low emissions choices, you've got to do this thing. And we monitor and we continue giving that advice. So we can help with that. We're not the sole answer, but we can keep shining a light on you and not taking this advice. You are leaving people behind, or you're carrying on, just expanding and hoping somehow we'll get there while we are sucking, you know, fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them end of the night. And so our role can help to a degree in that, be the full solution, but that monitoring role we can try to like what governments are or aren't doing as well.
Mary, did you want to comment at all on equity in relation to the transition?
Not right now.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think
just not on the question.
I don't think so.
I could. I think one of the issues with the ETS, it's seen as this game, right? And it is a bit of a game. It's a fake market for a commodity that the government makes up, right? But it's a useful tool if done right. And so the problem at the moment is, you know, you're giving away most of the credits for free to the polluters. So if you actually sold all the credits to the polluters as government through the auctioning type system, then you would have this revenue from polluters, which you could then use to help and support those that are going to be most hurt by this transition, right? So even that tool can be used to...
No, you can't. This is a physics problem. It's not a monetary problem. You can't feed money at people if there's nothing to buy. It's not worth anything.
Sure.
Okay, you're running with an artificial system that is, because it's just numbers fed out by banks as debt and handed out to people. It's an expectation that there'll be energy in the future. There is not going to be the energy in the future to pay back the expectations that there are now globally. And you're still playing with this game that somehow you're going to incentivize people and recompense people with what? Money? They need to eat. They need shelter. They need water. That's not money.
But can't
Sorry.
you get those things?
No, you
with
can't
money,
get
but-
those things with money if they're not there. We've just seen it with eggs.
Thank you for coming here and talking to us. My name's Paul Much. I've had some political aspirations. What I'm interested in to see in the audience here, how many people come from a council or a councillor, any representatives here from any one of the jurisdictions? Where are you from?
I'm the coastal specialist for DCC.
Great. That's of interest to me. Thank you.
Question about what does iwi-led leadership look like? We talked about this a bit about ensuring there's more representation from the communities there, but there is this fundamentally different way of knowing from an Indigenous worldview, processes and knowledge systems. So what is the work that you all are going to do to allow for that leadership to exist when there's such a shift there, and how you're going to open the framework of thinking to allow that to grow without shoving them into the current mold of what Western science looks like and this evidence-based reasoning we use to make decisions.
Yep, and I probably give similar to Barry's to the early answer. So a big part of our role is that advice to government, and so generally it is a high level and direction of travel. So the government agencies and departments and things are the ones that are developing the detailed policy and approach. So our advice would sound like a cop out as a start to the question, but the ministries and those agencies really need to be working with Iwi Māori and led by them, not directly to them what it should look like. I think from our experience and from talking to different groups, different hapu and different councils, there are examples on the ground where there has been probably more a smaller scale of really Iwi hapu whānau led working alongside with councils to develop those approaches. For ourselves, we are developing our approach to how we interact with Motuana, for want of a better word, because you're exactly right. A Western, you can very easily get into discussions or arguments, but Western science of Motuana, and to me that's actually the right conversation. You've got a cultural system and you've got a Western cultural system, science is part of it. So the scientists understanding they're part of the system rather than have the answers is probably the greatest thing that scientists can understand. And practitioners and understand Motuana helps you actually broaden out, think about the part of the system, and science gives you some information, but what you do with it is a critical thing. So we're starting that journey as a commission ourselves. We've just established that program to help advise our board on how we should develop this approach going on this journey, and we're looking at how we can build those enduring relationships so we don't just come in and consult and turn up and disappear again. We actually build connection, understand what happens and form our work. So it's probably not giving it too much of an answer, but we're thinking our journey for ourselves, and then our advice is very much government. We need to talk and understand, think and develop and allow everyone to develop and lead in that approach rather than directing from central government and turning up town and build it. So yeah, we don't have the exact answers. It's identifying the real need and saying government will need to truly work along with utility and the treaty and taking the function about how we do it. So, plenty of whole lot of answers that are probably a bit unsatisfactory for people as given our role. But
I mean, one of the things I heard from was that you are doing the internal work, right? And that's part of the process if you're going to build meaningful reciprocal relationships to show that you know how to listen, right? And actually listen. Right?
yes, listening, coming and talking and explaining. listening and understanding.
I could probably just add, sort of just following the thread from the gentleman's question in the back and up the front here as well. I think to borrow your turn of phrase. So I think the Climate Change Commission has the opportunity to double down too on some of the advice. You know, the treaty was signed in 1840, like quite a wee while ago now. And so we're not in the same position that we were then, or really in this sort of revitalization, I suppose, or catching up, let's say. I think there is opportunity to sort out the treaty house, right? And that's the advice to government. And there's many, many, many things, leading scholars, some in the room, right over here. So who can help to advise to do that? Then the treaty house is sorted. And then also in the Te Tiriti house, those things as well, we have the opportunity to double down, particularly with the growth within. We have leading world scholars here, also very, very, very experienced Indigenous leaders across the country. So we actually do have the opportunity to not to lightly, I guess, and I understand where the commission sits within its legislature, but we actually do have the opportunity to do that. And I think, you know, toward the end of the consultation process, to have some of those things really clearly defined would be really positive to do. And then you can say, actually, this is what it's going to look like. This is how we're going to push government. And actually, this is what government needs to do. It's already been set out back in 1840. And if people haven't read the treaty, it's 1 page long. It takes you literally about 5 minutes to read. And also the translations of the Māori one as well. And so those things are already clearly prescribed and described in there. So I think you do have the opportunity to double down on it, and many people who can support to be able to do that, to build on the work that's already done. Yep.
Would you mind speaking up a little more about your question?
Thank you everybody for your cordial. I have so many questions, but I'll try to stick to one. I haven't read the Act closely, but I have maybe just one question. In terms of what you were talking about before in part 5A, B, I think it is.
Yeah, 5E.
Do you think that that is enough? I mean, you provide advice, right? The government can listen, it can ignore. So in that regard, I think one of the other points you were making was around gross targets, a pathway to gross targets. And I think the government is not even looking at that, but it should. Maybe that's something you talked about. Can't remember one of the two of you. Yeah, and I've been thinking about that the last couple of weeks. But clearly that's a problem from your points of view. So if the government ignores it, then, well, what? So I wondered, getting back to my question in the statute, should there be something here? Is there room for improvement in the statute for, if you give advice, is that enough? Should there be room for improvement in the statute to make the government more accountable? The minister, in other words.
Yeah. Yes, so the legislation, the government doesn't have to take advice. They have to set out the reasons why, if they choose not to, and also how they will achieve the purpose of the Act and the requirements through another means. So if you think of the emissions budgets now, our advice there, and then the plan, which is to help achieve the budgets, they can say, well, no, we're going to ignore your advice, but to meet all those requirements of thinking about impacts on regions, thinking about intergenerational. If you say the ETS just do its thing, then you've got to show how that is an equal outcome for future generations or for rural communities. Or so again, they can say whatever they like, I guess, and claim it meets those requirements. But there is that requirement to show they still have signed up to the targets and the budgets, and the major parties have all said we support those stepping stones down. So if they don't take our advice, they still have to put plans in place that should meet those targets. And in our monitoring role, we can come back and say, well, this, in our view, this is completely inadequate. The settings or the things you put in place, you can do our calculations and our estimations and things to say, fall far short, or it's going to create huge costs or impacts or whatever it might be. So there's those internal checks, but say it's doesn't necessarily hold them to actually doing anything. Yeah, very quickly through the thoughts on that.
When I first thought about coming to join and work with the commission, my first reaction was, what is this entity for? Like, I know the UK has a climate change commission, other countries have other apparatuses. Like, what is this for? Is it a government funded think tank? What is this piece of architecture? And what it's for is to, if you think about, the bare bones policy cycle, plan, do, check. We at the commission are a depoliticized plan function. We've taken, the government has said, take the front end of the policy development cycle out, put it in a third-party expert group. And most importantly, as Grant said, there's transparency for people in the public about where that strategic advice, it's the do. In other places, if there's no climate change commission, most of the work we do would get done to some extent, but a lot of it would probably be cabinet confidential, like this advisory and long-term work. And so what does the commission do? What's the value of it? It's a tremendous sunlight opportunity. In other situations, in other years, the example that's spoken to about our advice on the NZETS being given, not being taken, being given, and now we'll see that no one would have had the benefit of that transparency, and therefore people wouldn't know how they want to vote on certain things and what's important. So I know that's a weird answer, but even though we're only advising and we're not setting regulations or implementing plans or anything like that, the transparency of the advisory function, I think, is really valuable because it raises the level of discourse, it allows people to have insight into these super important decisions that are going to affect everybody for the decades to come. That's a matter of discretion. Yeah, it's very personal, that answer.
Do we have a question on the chat?
Last bit, sorry, Lauren. The very last bit. What was the other drivers, and then what were they? What was the three policy approaches that we had in the price?
Yeah, so I guess what's the easiest way to answer that? In the front end of this document, we vocalized what is our approach to thinking about essentially policy failures or what's going on. It's pretty darn simple. It's pricing to influence investments, choices, and behaviors. So emissions pricing, not too complicated there. And the second thing is realizing that we're humans and we don't always do things optimally. What are the system issues or barriers that exist that need to be taken away? And then the third part is about planning for the future and enabling the next generation of green technology or any other kind of innovation or system transformations, whether that's technology in given industries or industrial change or, what does the future look like? So I think that's maybe the first swing at how we think about essentially our approach to market failures, price them, help people respond to prices and get ready for the future, simply. I think the other thing is, especially in this emissions reduction, in this document, this open consultation, its focus is to give the government advice on how to hit the second emissions budget. It's in place. It's not advice on what's good to do, all things considered. We have a few points that we're tethered to, and they are, the budgets are in place, and we're working to that. Whether those are good budgets or not, we can't opine on that. Someone will judicially review us, and it'll be a waste of everyone's time if we act outside of our remit. The good thing is that and the matters that Grant spoke to, Section 5M, wellness and well-being are integrated through those things. So, if we give government advice on any of these matters that don't have those elements to it or don't have those considerations, they'll hand it back to us because we haven't executed our remit properly. So, yeah.
And Sebastian, if you have any thoughts on prices aren't doing the job, other levers or options, or how else you affect change and get action.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously a proponent for having a functioning ETS. Problem is it's not functioning, right? And I think the prices were starting to really impact decision making. And then we've let the policies slip over the last year, as I've said. So when I teach about the ETS to my students, I always say, you know, it was a good idea and concept at the start. Then we had a change of government and they pulled out all the teeth. And then we had a change of government and they tried to jam the teeth back in, but they're all crooked, right? So we currently have this sort of less than optimal regulation around the ETS, right? Because you want a supply and demand to set the price, which would incentivize the cheapest way to reduce emissions. Problem is, if you allow Pinus radiata plantations, that's going to be the cheapest way, right? So we need to have this game, but we need to set the rules of the game carefully. I think outside of that, you've got the climate disclosures, and you know, you could increase actual subsidies to good activities and co-investment in projects that can help, right, and supporting people. I also think the idea of having two different emission prices for the ag and ETS pricing schemes is a really bad idea that's going to lead to people trying to create what we call arbitrage opportunities in finance, so profit without risk, by gaming the two games or systems against each other, which is not going to lead to what we want either. Yeah.
And I would probably just add, Colin, to your question, in relation to understanding wellness in particular, sort of back to some of the points I made at the beginning, is that the fragmented at the moment, the connections, so the policy components are there, that's on page 23, you can flick onto it. There, some of the things are implied rather than being explicit. And I think if we're still using the same tools to fix the house that's fundamentally broken, then there is opportunity, which is here. I think it can just be pushed out further in relation to wellness. And the model of wellness that the Climate Change Commission is using, I think many people would really get on board with what that is. And the drivers around that are really clear. I'll just bring it up here too. So you have aspects around the importance of spirituality. So that essence of what a well-functioning world looks like. And then around the outside, you have the environment actually centered, which of course, talking about climate change, some of those obvious things are missing. And then around the outside, you have these different drivers around the people part. So it's there, but I think again, is that some of the things can be made more explicit, because as we get narrowed down into focusing on some of the things that are fundamentally flawed in the system, then most likely we will still arrive at the same outcome too, if we still wanted to use the same ways, partly of which has created the issues that we're currently in. So that is there, Colin, and looking at, it's called He Ara Wai Order, which is this wellness framework that's come out of Treasury that they're utilising, which some very well-respected Māori researchers have put together.
Well, thank you. And thanks for being here today. Really interesting conversation so far. And I'd like to just leap in at the point where you said that the major role of the Commission is to be the kind of the plan bit of the policy cycle. And I would put to you that you're doing more than planning. Part of what you're doing is you're creating stories about the future. And that is a really powerful role and should not be overlooked. When I started working in the climate change and energy space probably 15 years ago, I really believed that we could make a difference, that we could reduce our emissions rapidly enough that the major impacts of a changing climate would not occur, that we would be able to follow the safe path. I now no longer believe that. And I think most of us are realizing that we are likely on one of the very dangerous paths of climate change. So to me, that says a lot of things. It says that we are heading into a future of increasing destabilization of global economic systems, of global energy flows, and implications for the kind of trajectories that we're trying to achieve through this emissions reduction plan. So to me, the emissions reduction plan should place itself within the context of a destabilized world in which a lot of those expectations about increasing growth, increasing prosperity, and the ability of green technologies to pick up the slack somehow and magically take us into a well-being future where everybody's rich and wealthy and etc. That is not realistic. And I think we have to start talking about that. We have to start making that a realistic belief in people's heads that we're heading to a future of the need to be much more frugal in how we live and how we live our lives, and are much more realistic about the expectations about what we can achieve through emissions reduction plans. And realistically, the first emissions reduction plan is picking off the really easy soft fruit that's ready for picking. The next one gets harder, the next one gets harder and harder. And as they get harder, the difficulty in achieving, a future in which we're all wealthy and drive electric vehicles is increasingly unlikely. At the other end of that spectrum, we do a lot of work with Māori communities who are facing the real impacts of climate change and at the same time are doing what they can to reduce emissions. And what they are doing and saying is, let us build resilience at the local level. Let us clean our waterways. Let us grow gardens. Let's bring people back here. Let's have warm, healthy homes and live in a way that we can cope with the kind of disasters we can see are happening, look after people, but live at a modest scale. We don't all need electric Audis. We just need to be able to look after our people. I think, to me, that is the kind of story that we need to be repeating across all our communities. And you, as a commission, need to be making a realistic story for the future of this country.
I can respond really quickly. Thank you. And about next year this time, put a marker in your calendar. The work that the commission does that kind of tells a story about the future is when we propose budgets to the government, because we, generally speaking, say we think that this is a doable, an achievable, ambitious state of the world that New Zealand should shoot for. And so emissions budgets 1, 2, 3 are in place, but just about next year this time we'll be consulting on emissions budget 4, which is for the 2036 to 2040 period. So that's a really, I'm going to remember you said, what kind of story are we telling about, the end of next decade, and what's the art of the possible, and what does that world look like? And is this something that we think the government should, design policy for? I think that's our big storytelling role. And luckily for us and the country, we're on a treadmill for that. We do it every 5 years, and we must consult on that. And so you will have an opportunity to provide input, and the transmission of advice is transparent as well. So I think that's a really valid way to say it.
And to support that, Barry, I'd say also we have a task every 5 years to review the target. And so there's a whole range of criteria in the Act around what our process for that and what we might recommend about any changes to the 2050 target. And that requires us to look at the latest science as well, international development. So is there more uncertainty? What are the trajectories of likely temperature outcomes, global stability, all those things to factor in as well. So again, the storytelling of looking out on the 5 years to the future, what is it looking like, and how should we be thinking and setting up our targets, but also in our advice that what that might mean, thinking about adaptation, exactly right. How do you think about mitigation and adaptation in the possible world you need to be adapting to? So they need to be joined together. And those local examples that we talk to, just such richness in some of those examples from some of those Hartford and work. And we have a project called Maui Tech, where we've worked with 12, 13 case studies at the Hartford and whānau level, where our Rautaki Māori team have gone out and just listened to understand what the stories are of those different right around the country. And we see that as forming those enduring relationships at that flat streets level. And the participants have agreed that we make those stories and resources available. So there's resources there for people to see what are the stories of the local people and what are their aspirations and challenges, what have they put in place to be able to adapt and be resilient in things as well. So trying to gain that real grounded understanding and make that available as visible as people want it to be. It's their stories, their tikanga, to give those examples as well of how you live in a more circular, sustainable way that you don't need the tripping and the trips around the limit for things. How do you really reduce your footprint and increase your well-being? So there was a range of strands there that relate to that. What various spaces, I guess, these things come in.
No, we'll just add to support Janet's kōrero there, of course. We, over the next couple of days, have our National Centre of Research Excellence Symposium. We have families, groupings coming in from Rakiura, Stewart Islands, from Whariponga up on East Cape, devastated from Cyclone Gabriel, from Taitukido in Northland, coming down, and also from Waikato or Kawhia here as well. And they're sharing the same message to our Māori communities, as well as our Pacific communities who are, there isn't a lot of focus within Pacific communities within this too, and also our rural communities as well, ensuring that their voices are shared too. And so it's making sure that those stories are heard, as Janet said, and then also how those connections can be made, because many of those stories are similar across the country in Aotearoa, but also across the Pacific too, and across the world. And also not just leaving those stories there, because it is also the role of government to ensure that those stories are captured, but also that government is doing its job that it should be in making these things that are occurring at the grassroots level, so that then they can be more supported and appropriately resourced too, but at the right levels. And because people will be getting on, irrespective of what government's doing too. And so I think having those two parts of the system coming together are really critical.
I'm just going to go to Janice Lord's question. Janice is from botany. I don't think it's helpful to demonise radiated pine. We need a more nuanced view of how to gain carbon sequestration benefits while facilitating multi-use, multi-generational forestry that provides an ongoing benefit locally and nationally. So her question is, how can a carbon pricing scheme incentivise the above approach to carbon forestry?
Well, I think when you're sitting in a panel and you have to respond briefly to questions, sometimes nuance can get lost. I think there is a place for pine. I just don't think it's as big as it has become. And I don't necessarily think that pine for timber should also be earning carbon credits, for example, right? There are concepts around using pine and then transitioning that to native forests, but the research on how and when that is possible is not yet complete. There is some factors we know about, so pest control, the right climate, and the right like the heat and the water, and then there was the management practices around that, right? But the pest control is obviously a big one, and the climate. So you can't do it in every part of the country, and you have to control for the pests, which is hugely expensive. So, if you want to use pine early on to, as like some people say, is jet fuel for sequestration, right? That could potentially work, but we don't know that it will work. Right? So that's why my view is more conservative around using pine. I think in the advice, you actually say that that's a dangerous game to play, but then in the recommendations or the reduction plan, there's something like 360,000 hectares of new exotic forests. So it's on page 8, the path to net zero, whatever. But we already have 175,000 hectares of new forests since 2022. So we've used up a lot of that already. So that's why I try to get people to be cautious around pine and the ETS. There's potentially, rather than just bluntly banning it, which was proposed last year, and we submitted on that, there's a lot of nuanced ways to go about that. There might also be other ways to encourage other forests through something like a biodiversity credit and things, but then, we're just layering up complicated system that can have blunders on top of complicated system that can have blunders. So let's get the baseline one right. Again, rather than having an ag and an ETS, why not have one that works and is appropriate for all? Right? So again, I don't think pine is evil. I just think it needs to be used in the right place in the right way.
Right, we're all going now. I don't know how to say.
Not open a can of worms.
We'll go,
Oh, again.
no, sorry, at the
Oh, no.
back there. Just,
I was just going to say, listening to it all, I've been thinking about, thanks to the NAHU academic who said that, you know, we've been struggling to meet our commitments since 1840. You know, we've had the IPCC going for a number of decades, and, you know, that's, you know, a similar thing in a way. It's got scientists and it's got, you know, and it's restricted and it's political, you know, restricted in its political thing, so it'll be acceptable to, and yet they're saying, you know, things are really bad. They've been saying that for a while, and nothing much has really changed. It hasn't changed the, you know, the governments and countries and the economy hasn't done what's required yet to bring things under control. You guys are in a similar position in a way. You started up, you're giving advice. Some governments may or may not. It seems like they're not really doing enough, despite your advice, your good advice. So I guess I'm just thinking, reflecting on what Janet and Mario said. It seems like it's not going to work. We're not on a safe pathway, and we, you know, what do you guys think? Are we going to achieve any kind of safe pathway that will keep us from massive system failures, you know, financial collapses and you know, technology failures? Because it seems like, yeah, I'd just like to know what you think about that actually.
Can I just come back to that question and just be rude and just make sure that no one had any questions when all the hands went up about pine? Because I just wanted to kind of finish off that pine bit. Yeah, and then come back, because I think it's a great question. Please don't, yeah, but I just think it's going back to that, and I just want to make sure everyone's had the pine discussion if you wanted to. Yeah.
In terms of not including pine in the ETS, be interested to know more of your thoughts on that. Particularly, I think there's a disconnect in the emissions reduction plan around the role that exotic forestry can play generally, and also decarbonising our construction sector, where there's a little bit more attention paid to that. But I think there's some much more explicit links that can be paid there or made there. And buildings can be potentially a really good place in the short term to store carbon. And if we take more of that approach and we think, so within the ETS at the moment, there's no consideration of where the timber goes once the trees are harvested, but that makes a big difference in terms of where the carbon ends up. And if we encourage better uses of the timber, the land that those trees came from, multi-rotational forests, you know, most forest owners aren't cutting the trees down once and moving on. That doesn't make any sense financially or otherwise. So you can actually get a cumulative benefit from the same area of land. So there's sort of this narrative that the forest estate has to keep expanding infinitely to do the job. And that's not the case if we are smart with what we do with that timber. And at the same time, we need more houses, we need more buildings in New Zealand, and we can reduce a lot our dependence on concrete and steel in that area too. But I think if we take timber plantations out of the ETS, we can potentially undermine that role as well.
So if I could just, one of the thing I would like for everybody to walk out of the room understanding is that in chapter 3 and also, or sorry, in chapter 4, the emissions pricing chapter, and also in chapter 10 about forests, the commission doesn't express a disdain for forestry or anything like that. There's loads of, as you say, recognition about the benefits of it. You know, the point of this advice is saying there's factors in play here with, you know, a almost unique globally appetite for sequestration and providing NZUs into the market through that relative to the demand side of the market. It's going to go it might go pear-shaped here, and the NZ ETS might not be the tool that helps take us on the path to net zero for long-lived gases, as people probably sit in their chairs and hope or plan for doing right now. So it's more a matter of, you know, there's nothing wrong with the tool, there's nothing wrong with the action, but there's factors in play and the ability to supply versus other things that it may not go as slick as everybody hopes it does unless deliberate decisions are made. And that's kind of the backside of the recommendations in chapter 4 is that all kinds of forests and biodiversity for lots of different reasons are going to play a role in having a better world in the future, hopefully. And the point is that, you know, credible, durable incentives and information paradigms are required for that. And an NZETS price going like that maybe is not the best for the long arc planning that forestry companies do or land management companies do, or folks that are going to invest in those pest management and things like that. It's just not a great fit for the incentives and the outcomes that you're looking for. And so that's the point of this advice is careful now. Like it's a tough point that we find ourselves in.
And can I just add, so when I'm raising some of the concerns around Pinus radiata, it's mostly around these permanent carbon forests, right? And the problem with those is they are often not managed like a harvested forest. So you're not pruning, you're not, trimming down your number of trees after 5 years to see which ones are going to be the good timber trees, etc. Right? So these forests a lot of these forests aren't grown for timber. They're grown purely to get the carbon credit. Because with a timber forest, there's now the averaging method of receiving credits. So that actually, it used to be, okay, as your trees grow, you get credits. At the end, when you cut them down, you have to repay some credits because you're releasing carbon, right? Based on whatever scientific average, depending on the use. I'm sure that factors in there somewhat. I don't know those details, right? But now it's you earn sort of an average if it's a harvestable forest, right? If you're going to harvest. However, there's this idea, I think it's being introduced, this permanent forest category, where you still earn credits as your trees grow, right? And so the risk with Pinus radiata as a permanent forest is in 50, 80 years, when those trees start falling over, right? Who's going to be there to pay back the carbon credits? The people that are setting up these entities growing carbon forests certainly aren't, right? Maybe they're kids, but I doubt they're still owning those companies because they know what's going to come. So I think timber. Of course we need timber, but timber should be a commodity on its own and a business model that works on its own, especially if we're going to use it more in construction. Why do they need an extra subsidy to grow more pine? That's what I don't quite understand. Whereas I'd rather see the carbon credits generated by forest restoration, native forest restoration projects, which are far more expensive, right? But also have these other biodiversity and other positive externalities, resilience and storms, etc. If it slopes, we saw with the cyclone, maybe if all that pine had been native forest, it might have looked a bit different, So yeah, again, there's a lot of nuance within that. I hope that helps.
I think one reality with exotic forests is that, especially at a large scale, very few forest owners have a single age class forest. That's one of the ways they make harvesting and carbon sequestration work. So they're offsetting liabilities from harvesting by accumulating credits with growth of younger trees. And I'm not sure of the exact numbers at the moment, but it'd be interesting to know more about the exact breakdown of players in the market that are focused just on the sequestration, because you can do both sequestration and harvesting quite viably. And they're mostly backed by investment firms who want to maximize returns. So you're never going to maximize your return if you only focus on carbon. If you have a timber carbon mixed business model, that's going to earn more money for the investor. And certainly people I know in the forestry industry still, most of them are saying that very few of those forests have been planted for carbon specifically. So yeah, I think there's probably some more detail needed there, but I think, and maybe not within this room or within this group, but at a larger scale, there is a pretty full-on narrative around forestry, and that some pretty negative stories around that I think there's definitely more scope to do.
Which immediately goes back into buying things that energy made, which creates our problem. You have to actually do this without making money. And this is the whole thing I said at the beginning. Somehow we have to get doing things to the physics of our problem without making more money, which we then spend on more stuff, which makes the physics of the problem worse. This is the unpin we have to do.
I'd love to see a solution to that.
I guess the idea is that the polluters make less money on those activities, and we encourage activities that are positive for that problem, right? That's the whole concept of the market solution. So
Yeah, but if
penalise
making people
polluters.
make money and then they
Currently,
spend that
under
money,
the
then
settings,
it's
it's not
any
great,
solution at all, because it's adding to the problem at the front end.
I agree, yeah. So we need to fix the tool.
Thanks for being here and the great discussion. I just wanted to tautoko Janet's point earlier, really. I think, people here are the solution. Yes, there's market things we can do, but really it's people. I'm also at council, you didn't see my hand up earlier, but we've been talking broadly with the community here, developing our emissions reduction plan for the city. And some of the key themes that we've heard when we've been talking with the community are that people want stronger communities, people want places, spaces they can connect, to know their neighbours, to be able to share resources. People want local food. This is resilience as well as mitigation. And people want less of this sort of linear economy. Why are we wasting stuff? Why are we not using things again? I know in previous advice from the Commission that role of local government or local communities has been mentioned in, I would say it's been sort of watered down in government policy. So I would suggest that's an area that perhaps you could power up or double down on again in the future, because I do think it is the solution here. Thank you.
And thank you for that. We've, as part of this engagement, we've been talking to a few councils around and about and similar messaging. And I think that you're right, the power, for the role, opportunities that councils in their communities, it's untapped. And I'd agree. I think that I don't know if central government really actually realises the resource that's there, the expertise and the enthusiasm and the opportunities and ideas people have got. So yeah, and we certainly point to that, but I'd love to hear feedback and I'd love submissions on that to really help strengthen that advice to shine a light on that and try and get more support and more focus there, because yeah, it's people. People have to see themselves, see a future, and they're the ones that make decisions to do the stuff. So glad to hear that. And make a submission.
So probably just add, coming back to the point at the back, that's why we're here, right? We have to. I mean, I think there's probably gone are the days, well, I hope, now of climate deniers too. We are on a crash course for a very, very bad future. I think that's why we're all here in the room, certainly why we're doing our jobs up here. I think a part that is missing, following up on your point, the year, it's not my area of focus, but within our wider network, we have researchers who focus on the psychology of human behaviour too. At the individual level or the agential level, there are things that we all individually can do. And I think in those wellbeing spaces, there is the opportunity to look at that within the reporting. What is it that people can do in the sense of helplessness too, at a future that's coming that's grim? And I think that those are the things that we can collective-wise, which I think the role, part of why I agreed to come on here when Sarah asked too, is that we do have the ability from an individual level, but also the communities that we come from, the various professional backgrounds that we all have to actually contribute into what the Climate Change Commission is doing to advise government. Obviously, we can all vote with our feet in a few months as well. We have whatever's ahead of us in terms of the political landscape in New Zealand at the moment. I mean, we have to. And I do think that's why we're here, certainly why I'm here too, and why we continue to do the work that we're doing. The things we can do on a personal level, of course, the individual changes that we make, and then also the things we can do professionally to actually galvanise to change those things. And our, little wee island nation in the southernmost point of the Polynesian Triangle within Aotearoa, we can make those changes and to be able to showcase, hopefully, to the rest of the world, what does it actually look like? And to by fundamentally questioning some of these things that are in front of us. That's my 5 cents anyway.
The discussion around pine really brought up the question of what I didn't hear is where is the conversation about blue carbon sequestration? So you're a world-leading island nation who comes from the ocean, right? And the forestry is in the underwater forest as well. And is there conversation around that? And all the marine animals who are big carbon sequestration contributors. And so I'd love to hear where is that in the narrative? Because it's really, really important and an opportunity. It's unique about Aotearoa that you get to add to the conversation.
Details if we need to. Yes, and I think Aotearoa has been pretty slow to link up the party in reality. Other countries and nations and researchers and indigenous peoples have been much more in the forefront. Not, there's really probably the exception for people around the country that have really been thinking about it. So we've been pretty slow to think about blue carbon or jump to solely sequestration opportunities. There's adaptation and resilience and a whole range of things, and that the resources that the marine environments provide and those initial habitats and the buffering and resilience against sea level rise and things. So we've been pretty slow to the party. In terms of budgets, we get them caught up in accounting rules, and you have to be able to count and so that it's permanent and additional and all sorts of things. So in terms of the development of actually feed into budgets and say where we see this sequestration of blue carbon, our systems aren't quite there yet to have them in the inventory, which is very governmental and processing things, but to be able to factor into the budget. So in terms of actually getting them into budgets, the information and processes and things aren't quite there yet, but we are completely supportive. And as we enter adaptation space as well, really looking at how can the blue economy, blue carbon, those environments help us to adapt. What are the risks, what are the opportunities, and those adaptation functions for us are just starting up now. So we see a real opportunity there, but also actively linking the mitigation and adaptation when we're thinking about what you do, thinking about impacts and opportunities, not just solely for the mission functional sort of focus. So it's an area that we are behind the game on. I think there's opportunities there for us in terms of our budgets. We need processing things to actually feed into the budgets, but we can point to where the opportunities, where the research needs, where are people doing great stuff that can be built upon, what the key benefits like stories and building on those. So it's a bit of a gap that we're aware of, and in our different streams of advice, we're really keen that we keep helping to support, highlight the opportunities and the gaps, and help to get great appreciation and good information. So it's about my soil carbon as well. We have great soil carbon, really good soils, and people talk about, well, should we have that in our budgets? And there's a huge stock there, but it can be pretty hard to manage. And if you have a drought and wetting rains, and you lose a huge stock, is there a liability someone has to pay for that? How do you, is it best to factor in, is it best to have settings rules that encourage really good, healthy soils that have, good, productive, resilient farming practices that are requiring fewer inputs and resilient things, or do you bring it into your actual accounting? So there's some things to think through of how best to try and monetize it, and parameterize it, or other ways to really bring it. So that's a long waffly answer, but we're very aware that it's.
You've been having an example of world use caution, right? Like, if you're going to really move towards listening up to Indigenous voices and worldviews, and then boiling it into a budget, then that's an opportunity for growth and change and what you're accounting as a value system. Anyway.
Can I just add a point there? Because I think I've talked to people who've talked about sequestration projects that could be funded by ETS credits, right? There's this, and we're talking about pines, not pines, what should we include? I think we're focusing a lot on the sequestration side, which, as you mentioned, has its own issues, right? Why aren't we focusing on the emissions side, right? We currently have legislation going through government that will increase the industrial allocation of free credits to emitters, right? So let's get that right before we start adding more sources of sequestration, because otherwise you're going to have an oversupply of credits, a low price, and emitters still having mostly a free ride, and then for the ones they have to pay for, don't have to pay much, right? So I agree that all those projects are good, but if we just injected them into the ETS, it would be catastrophic, right? So the way I see it, and I was kind of mentioning it with the ag earlier, and I'm glad you brought that up, is that you have the ETS quite clean, right, on proven things, sequestration, and then the type of outcomes you want. Maybe you don't want Pinus radiata being permanent carbon farms, for example. And then you use that revenue, as is proposed in the ag scheme, to incentivize other things where we're not so sure yet on the exact amount of carbon or the risks around up and downs and volatility. And so you encourage things like ocean projects, wetland restoration, regenerative agriculture, etc., through that process, through a subsidy that's funded by the polluter's emissions. That's how I kind of think those things that we don't have the clear accounting rules, especially under our national contributions to the Paris Agreement, we don't have the clear rules there to be able to validate or to do that in a transparent and accurate manner. So then you get the revenue that the government can generate through the ETS if they actually charge for emissions, as they supposedly are, then you can encourage these things to happen with that money.
Okay, no, can we just, sorry, because I'm really conscious of time now. I've been asked for lots of questions, so I'm going, Janet here and then Frank. And then there'll be time afterwards to keep talking as well. Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to change the discussion a bit. I have a PhD student who's looking at voluntary carbon markets, and she's particularly looking at the interests of New Zealand businesses in being able to invest in carbon offsetting opportunities within New Zealand, not only in forestry, but in things like, assisting houses to become more energy efficient, thereby saving carbon credits, et cetera, et cetera. So she's looking at both the supply side and the demand side of a kind of potential emerging market, particularly as businesses want to be able to claim some form of, carbon neutrality or other claims around carbon, carbon numbers. And there are obviously pros and cons to voluntary carbon markets. And I am just interested in where the Commission sees the role of these, because they are playing outside of the ETS, outside of any requirements of businesses to offset or whatever, balance their compulsory credits, but these are voluntary ones in addition to that. So any views on that?
You want to go ahead? You have any thoughts on voluntary stuff?
A little bit. I'll be
go for
quick. So in New Zealand, where we have a regulated ETS, there's a danger around voluntary carbon markets, I believe, because the government counts our governmental or national level emissions and then uses that for our NDCs under the Paris Agreement, right? And as part of that, if we were to start selling credits overseas, there's a risk that they get double counted, right? Because now the government's claiming it, and whatever company from overseas might be buying those credits from New Zealand on the voluntary market is also counting that sequestration or reduction in emission. So then you have a risk of double counting, and that's the whole problem around the Article 6, I believe, of the Paris Agreement, where they can't quite figure out how to deal with this issue around international carbon markets, let alone having two separate markets, one regulated, one not, one contributing to Paris, one not. Then you have, are you actually getting your own carbon credit, or is the New Zealand government also claiming that sequestration, right? So there's just a risk there that needs to be figured out. Yeah, I just wanted to say that at some stage.
I'd add in there too, having just done my climate scorecard and stuff, that there's a real risk of greenwashing some of the offsetting schemes, and having looked at the major polluters in the country and where they're offsetting the different schemes, the level of detail you need to be able to understand what's going on with many of those companies is lost on many people, and therefore the element of greenwashing becomes more attractive or increasing. So I have a few issues.
And just maybe add one thing, the useful thing to think about there is, what does claim mean? In some ways, it doesn't really matter. Like, the ultimate claims are what the country does for the ND, like for its contribution to international accounting under the NDC and the Paris Agreement. Everything else is kind of strategy in the private sector. And so if people want to claim things, subsidize activities, it's kind of neither here nor there, because what comes out in the wash is going to be emissions to air, and that's what gets accounted for in the national inventory. So yeah, I think whenever I get questions or think about voluntary carbon markets, I always think, what do people think they're getting out of this? And it's not always what it might be. And as Sebastian has pointed out, that one of the major stumbling blocks for that is in New Zealand, almost all emissions are priced, especially those related to fossil fuel, through the NZETS. And so, in theory, if you're having emissions reductions associated with decreased fossil fuel use, the economic benefit of that decreased use is already captured somewhere. And so you are creating you are double dipping on the environmental attribute side. But it's always useful to go, what do people think they're getting here?
Just an observation on following what Anne-Marie was saying about the politic. My observation is you people are doing this work when you come to conclusions and you advise government. The next step is government will implement it, and then it goes through to the people, and how do we get it through the territorial district councils and so on. And as we go along, there are a number of wastegates. So the number of voters within regional voting is less than 50%. And then within that group, council becomes focused on the ratepayer. So you're at this end, their response is at this end to really the colonial model of preserving property rights, those values. And so council says it has a policy that incorporates what central government has said, but not actually program. And just for example, if we took the free water situation, so we have a government in power, 60 out of 67 councils opposed that. All the wellness benefits that could derive from that were obstructed. So we have a whole process of storing. And so that the wellness benefit is right at the end, and a few enthusiasts and groups put their energy into it, all under-resourced. And have you considered this, and what does anyone see a way through this?
I can answer the bureaucratic answer is that part of the the plan do check that I mentioned earlier, we do a planning part. As Grant mentioned, we also have a statutory check function where we have to monitor progress, both for emissions reduction plans, are they any good? The magic word is adequate. And for the national adaptation plans that are in place for a given period, are they any good? And so we have to give that first piece of advice to government on, is the national adaptation plan any good in the middle of next year in 2024? And one key plank of that work that we're just kicking off now is just what you've mentioned, the interface between local and government intentions. What are the relationships? What are the barriers? Even if there's a great national allocation plan for government, is there anywhere for it to get traction on the ground, and are the right people able to influence? So I think trying to understand that interface or lack thereof, hopefully will be an outcome that we surface from the National Adaptation Plan Monitoring Report. Whether we succeed in nailing down all the points or not, the good thing is that we have to do that work every 2 years. And so the country will be richer for being part of that work. And the first one's not going to be perfect, but it'll be out there. And then after that, we'll learn something and feedback and keep going. So the fact that most of that monitoring work and the checking work is on a treadmill 1 year or 2 years, there's a tremendous scope for continuous improvement and keep adding sunlight to where it needs to be.
So helpful.
It is.
Yeah.
I just look at New Zealand as basically two big farms, one called North of Ireland, one called South of Ireland. And we manage most of that ecosystem to a remarkable level. If you look at, we're at the top of the pyramid for the Anthropocene. We've adapted and modified and done everything to squeeze the wetlands and do all the things. So we're dealing with a very, very beautiful ecosystem where some of it's agricultural, some of it's just ecologically wonderful. But if we look, to me, the signals I'm seeing are we're incentivizing the intensivists. If we look at the signals that are coming out is dairy guys can produce more and more and more. There are externalities they can cope with because they've got a margin for profit. And we can, in fact, drive that profit machine as far as we like. And all we're doing is essentially subsidizing fertilizers and causing massive damage to the environment. So what we have to talk about is, I think, a balance in the system of producing from our farms. I would hope to think that in 10 years' time, we could stand up and say our products are carbon neutral, and we will show the world this, they will want this, and we will move on there in some sort of ecological balance. So I think if we look at the fresh water system, we can see if we give responsibility to rural communities, they will do really well. They've done brilliantly with fresh water. And all you've got to do is go and look at the Mataura and Pomahaka to see the gains they've made. And that's because communities take ownership. I was at a farm meeting during the week where there were about 60 regenerative or alternative sort of soil people. And every one of those had a different attitude to soil or what could be done or couldn't be done. And I say, if you take a look at maybe the Irish example, accepting that we've done nothing since Kyoto, and that's reality, we've done nothing. We've talked a lot, but we've done nothing. Now, how do we marshal a movement moving forward? Well, the Irish have taken a very pragmatic view. They know gaming is what they're into, and there's no better place than Ireland to game. But anyway, if you look at what they've decided there is, they've said, we're going to pick what we think could be ways forward which are positive. One is biodiversity. Let's talk about multiculture. Let's talk about producing crops which have multiple species in there. So how do we do that? Well, we subsidize. We don't take ownership. We subsidize farmers who are prepared to use biodiverse crops. And along the way, we will monitor the biological benefits of those, and we'll move forward. So hopefully in partnership, let the government who's got the right levy the abusers, let them take that money and give it to the mitigators. And then we may see something moving forward, because the rural communities, can do it. They can manage our ecosystem. They're the most wonderful husbandry men in the world, and we should be looking at a system for incentivizing, probably to a vehicle of subsidy rather than a vehicle of sort of taking over and paying for it all. But I think there's incredible potential out there. We have written off things like soil carbon just with a whim. I believe that if we look forward, and your Minister of Agriculture has said, well, he's a bit concerned that we've written off carbon. So maybe soil carbon seems to be an interesting option in other places. And there's a good reason to justify it here. The same we need, if we're talking about methane, the first thing we need to do is get the equation right on methane before we start talking about a levy. We're levying something we can't quantify. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff we need to do. We need to invest in core research. We need to provide subsidies for farmers to do their own experiments, and then we could move forward. So I think the farmers have the answer. I look at marriedom and say, it's offered us all the vehicle for to join with our environment to grow together. So we've got all these wonderful things. We're not fighting anybody other than ourselves.
I think that's a really nice way to finish, and I was kind of hoping by having you as the engineer that you would finish on something inspirational for us. So, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you all for your questions. I think there's been some clear messages from the audience today, and I think they have been probably nicely summed up by a few key speakers. But I was a bit disheartened to hear Janet's lack of optimism, because that was one of the things that when I worked with her was really apparent. But I think the fact that it's got to that position is really telling, and I think you've heard that not just from Janet, and I'm sorry I didn't get back to your question, but that you've heard that from a number of different people in the audience, that perhaps we need to start telling a story that is, I don't like to use the word realistic, but perhaps paints a picture of where we're actually going at the moment. We don't have to go very far to realise that our nationally determined contributions are not going to meet where we really need to be. And I know that puts you guys in a bit of a rock and a hard place because of your role that you have, but we need probably the Climate Change Commission to be taking on that role at some point, and probably, as we've indicated to you, quite soon. And the other thing I think is picking up around utility and having that as a really strong focal point, and I think Anne-Marie had some fantastic examples there, and also people who are willing to help in that area to make sure that whatever we do moving forward is utility led. And I think that's been really important to the audience as well. And I think the final thing that I've heard is around communities and around people, and about that notion of the grassroots and what's happening in the communities, and how we can exemplify that and celebrate it and also be really proud of some of those things that are happening in our communities, because that's actually where we're going to see some key points of change as well. Again, I thank you all for coming, and I think we've passed on some clear messages, but I think you're going to be around for a bit longer as well for any final questions or any clarification points or anything you want to. But yeah, can we just thank our panelists and also thank you very much for being here today.